Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar, Saving Local Transit in the Bay Area and Beyond. My name is Erika Sanchez, and I'm the Digital Content Manager for Island Press. I'm very happy to bring you this webinar, which is part of the Connecting Communities series that is put together by Transform in California. And our moderator, Chris, will go over that in a little bit. First, I'll go over some logistics for the webinar. We welcome you to ask any questions that you have during the discussion, and you can do that by entering them on the questions box that's on the right side of your screen. If you have any issues with that or need to contact us, there's also a chat box that you can use to reach out to us. Our moderator is going to ask questions at the very end of all of the presentations. We also want to remind you that following the webinar that you're going to receive an exit survey, and we ask you to please fill it out. That really helps us to put together webinars in the future. We'll also be recording this event, and we will send you the video in a few days. So now let me tell you a little bit about Island Press. We're an environmental nonprofit book publisher founded in 1984. Our mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment. We elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on crucial issues, and focus attention on sustainable solutions. Today, we're offering a special discount on the book Trains, Buses, People, which is written by our panelist, Christoph Spieler. You can get it for 30% off if you use the discount webinar. And now I'll introduce you to our panel. We'll have Christoph Spieler. He is Vice President and Director of Planning at Hewitt Solars and a Senior Lecturer at Rice University. He was a member of the Board of Directors of Houston's Metropolitan Transit Authority of Harris County, where he initiated a redesign of the entire bus system. At Hewitt Solars, he has done land use and transportation plans in a variety of settings. His recent work includes park planning for the Houston Parks Board and the Buffalo Bayou Partnership, and project management of a consortium of researchers addressing flooding in Houston. He teaches courses in architecture and civil engineering at Rice University and is a contributor to NACTU's Transit Street Design Guide. Christy Wagoner is Planning Director for SamTrans, where she oversees the short and long-range planning for San Mateo County's bus system. Prior to joining SamTrans, she worked for transit agencies in Livermore, Sacramento, and Fairfax County, Virginia. She holds a master's in public policy and a bachelor's in psychology and sociology, and is a graduate of the American Public Transportation Association's leadership program. Finally, our moderator is Chris Lepe. He's the Regional Director for Transform. He has over 15 years of experience leading campaigns, initiatives, and coalitions around transportation, land use, housing, and health policy. He has deep experience engaging diverse communities in policy, including outreach to service sector workers, business owners, and residents of lower incomes. He has taught courses in environmental studies, health science, and intercultural studies at the ANSA College and San Jose State University. He received his BA in environmental studies with a minor in Latin American Latino studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz, and his master's in urban planning at San Jose State University. Now I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who will be introducing the presentation.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. So this is very exciting. Very glad to bring this topic to you all today. And I'm only going to be spending about 5 minutes kind of framing the issue. And really the meat of the presentation will be provided by Christoph and by Christy. By the way, if you're curious as to why there's a Christy, Christoph, and Chris that are leading this conversation, it's totally by coincidence, I swear. So just another little word about our Connecting Communities series. So Transform and Island Press is bringing this series to you today, but we have a variety of fiscal sponsors, including the APA Northern California chapter, Commute with Enterprise, Housing, San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, Spare the Air resource teams, which are part of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and ZCLA. And we also have a long list of co-hosting organizations that include the Association of Community Transportation Northern California chapter, the APA Emerging Planners Group, Friends of Caltrain, Menlo Together, Menlo Park Complete Streets Commission, the MTC, People for Mobility Justice, Policy Link, Prospect Silicon Valley, Redwood City Forward, San Francisco Housing Action Coalition, Seamless Bay Area, Spur, and Urban Environmentalists. And this series really would not be possible without the support of all these groups and organizations. And special particular shout out to Island Press for this event. And if you're curious about the other events taking place, please visit our website at transformca.org. And just a quick check, can people see my screen at this point? Sounds like I can. So for the organizers, let me know if you can't see the screen, the slides, or if there's any glitches along the way. So a little bit of framing. We have about 800 million unlinked passenger trips on public transit across the nation. So public transit carries a huge amount of people, but there have been declines over recent years. I live in San Jose, California, and here our bus transit and light rail transit operator has seen a 23% drop from 2001 to 2016, while operating costs have risen. This is an issue both for equity as well as in terms of access to jobs, but also for traffic congestion, climate, and a lot of other social and environmental outcomes. So clearly improving ridership, increasing ridership and improving the transit system that will lead to ridership gains is very important for a variety of reasons. And we're going to be talking a little bit more and dissecting that, as well as strategies to increase transit use and to improve the system so more people will use it and it'll be more functional for more people. Some of the reasons that I'll just highlight as far as the various different reasons for declines across the nation include chronic disinvestment in service that has led to service cuts and fare increases, thereby spurring ridership losses, and as many of you know, kind of creates a little bit of vicious cycle there. One of the other trends, in particular for high growth areas like the Bay Area, is the increasing traffic, coupled with the lack of transit priority measures, which is resulting in transit travel times going down and a lack of predictability in terms of scheduling. Here in Santa Clara County, VTA cited that they have seen a decline of 1.5% in their bus transit speeds annually since 2013, and that corresponds with an extra $3.2 million just to maintain the same frequency of service every year for each one of those, for each 1% drop. So that adds costs and therefore ends up in the long term resulting in less service for the same amount of dollars that we might have to get that service out there. Other issues include higher costs for operators, in particular for areas like the Bay Area, where you see very drastically increasing housing costs and other labor costs. And the big issue that's been striking regions across much of the West Coast and other parts of the nation is the issue of displacement and the suburbanization of poverty, pushing our transit-dependent populations outside of the realm of the typical service areas that our transit operators, have served these populations in. So that's been a big issue in places like LA and Portland and here in Silicon Valley. There's also the issue of land use, and a lot of the job creation that has been created in the Bay Area has taken place outside of the catchment zone, the walkable areas near our transit systems, in particular regional rail. And so getting that in check is obviously going to be key, as many of you know. And finally, private sector competition, not just from large employers like Google and Facebook and places like Silicon Valley, which offer up transit services to their employees, and in some cases might compete with transit operating positions at the agencies, but also, as many of you know, the new mobility options like Uber and Lyft that could be suppressing ridership. So there's just a few. There's some debate in terms of whether or not some of these are actually impacting ridership, but I think for the most part, I think it provides a pretty good overview. So one of the slides that you'll see there in terms of ridership trends and the, what's going on here? Sorry. So just a little bit of a historical trend in the Bay Area. So you'll see that really the big trend here from the 1990s to 2016 has been the decline of bus transit ridership. So this is data from MTC, and commuter rail and some of these other options like light rail have seen some modest increases, in some cases significant increases. However, when you look at it from a per capita standpoint, you'll see that overall that the picture is not as bright. But in recent news, transit systems have been adding riders over the last year. And so some of those positive trends, there's a couple in the Bay Area, including AC Transit, which saw a 5 to 6% increase, 5.8% increase in transit use. You have Sacramento Regional Transit District, which saw a 10% increase for their light rail system, but still some declines in other areas, such as along the Caltrain corridor, Muni in San Francisco, and our big heavy hitter as far as ridership in the Bay Area, our BART system, which saw a 2.6% decrease. So in some ways a little bit of a mixed bag, but that could be viewed as a positive trend, because just a couple years ago we were looking at much more stark numbers. A couple of the things that we're doing here on Transform's side, on our advocacy side, we have long pushed for bus rapid transit implementation in the Bay Area, and we just recently released a vision for a highway-based regional express transit network that will connect the Bay Area like never before, running at 45-mile-an-hour speeds on much of the region's highways, and that is made possible through a growing network of express lanes that are being built, and that we're proposing to expand into a seamless whole for the region. And this network would have, as proposed to the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, 10-minute frequencies during the off-peak, 5-minute during the peak, building out to 2050, which is the regional transportation plan for the region. So we'll know more about the outcomes of that, as well as many other projects being considered for our regional transportation plan here in the Bay Area. If you're interested in more details about our regional express transit network proposal, which was a joint proposal with Spur, please check out our website. And the other big thing that we've been doing is pushing for more money for transit, because we know that as noted, one of the big issues with the transit ridership declines have been chronic disinvestment. And in San Mateo County, we built a coalition a couple years ago, which is still going strong today, that made the case for more money for transit, and got out there in the streets once it actually became a measure to get public support, made phone calls, went to transit stops, and leafleted, flyered, spoke with folks, and as a result, it passed by a very narrow margin, and about 60% of the measure is going to go towards bus transit capital and operations. So 50% will go towards Samtrans, which you'll hear a little bit more about what they got cooking up on their end, as well as another 10% for the TA, the Transportation Authority, for the type of longer range, longer distance potential express transit services that they might be implementing, such as on a Dunbar corridor. But the big story there was that as a result, we were able to avert something like a 25% service cut and fare increases. And now the agency is looking at and actually has adopted reduction in fares, free transfers, and looking at various different service improvements, which again, Christy will fill us in on. So that's a little bit about the context. And so as far as some of the questions that we're going to explore moving forward, wanted to kind of put a few of those out there so our speakers can touch on those, make sure to touch on those. How can we improve transit so it's more useful to more people? What are the factors that lead to higher ridership? How does the Bay Area compare to its peers? And what are some good things being done? What are some success stories to, as we've put it in the title of our webinar, to save local transit? So I will hand it off now to Christoph, who will take it from here.
Hey, Christoph, we can't hear you yet.
In my book about what makes successful transit. So next slide. I'm actually from the Bay Area. I grew up in Pinole. So Bay Area transit issues are very near and dear to my heart. Some of my first experiences riding transit were things like catching the BART Express bus to BART to go into San Francisco to look at the Christmas windows. Next. I now live in Houston, and when you imagine Houston, you probably think of a very car-centric city, but this slide is actually my life right here. You can see where I live, you can see where I work, and you can see the train that takes me between the two every day. My life is better on a daily basis because I have good transit available to me that's convenient, that's frequent, that's reliable. And that's why I care about transit. Ultimately, it's about making people's lives better. Next. What the book does is it covers every metropolitan area in the United States that has rail transit or bus rapid transit, all 47 of them. And in every one, it analyzes what kind of network do they have, how is that network performing, what decisions did they make, and what were the results of those decisions. And what you really see is a big range in how well transit is performing. But at its core, transit is always about the same basic things. Next. What transit does really well is use urban space. If you think about the number of people who can fit on a 40-foot bus, which takes the space of 2 or 3 cars, and then think about the same number of people who can fit in that space in cars, you understand why successful cities need transit. It simply uses that space better. It permits for more people to live there, it permits more economic activity, which is why at the heart of every successful city, you see transit systems. And that's true in San Francisco, and it's true in Oakland, and it's true in Houston. Next. One way to think about this is that in the average office building, somebody actually gets assigned less space for their cubicle than their car gets assigned in the parking garage. Next. If you think about what transit can do, when it works, it can make cities work dramatically better. Downtown Seattle, for example, over a decade, added 75% in population, 26% in jobs, and in that same period, cut the number of cars heading into downtown Seattle by 20%. And regardless of where you are, the same basic factors are the ones that drive good transit. So I will go through those now and also make some comments as to how that's worked out in the Bay Area. Next. So the first factor is density, which is really simple. The more people there are around your transit system, the more people that transit system is useful to. Every stop is a quarter or half-mile walkable circle, and the number of people in that circle determines how useful transit is. Next. One of the trends in the Bay Area has been that a lot of the region's biggest transit investments have actually been in places with quite low density. You can think about this BART train, which is going to have to cross 2 mountain ranges by the time it gets to San Francisco. Next. If you look at this map of the BART system, the red lines represent ridership on that segment. Highlighted in yellow is all of the recent expansions, and you will notice that all of those expansions have been in the lowest ridership parts of the system. BART is actually running out of capacity in the core, but all of the investments has been in relatively low density areas on relatively low ridership segments. Next. And so I will say that one of the best moves in Bay Area transit recently is the BART board's decision not to build to Livermore, to say, let's not do more of that low density, low ridership service, because that's not where we should be investing the most infrastructure dollars. Next. The other aspect of density is that it is something we can change, that every existing transit station is a chance to add density. And given the housing demand in the Bay Area, I think there's huge opportunities there. I put this contrast up on screen just to note that it surprises me to see that Houston is actually building higher densities around many of its transit stations compared to what I see in the Bay Area. Again, draw a quarter-mile circle around every BART station and think of how many people could live there. Next. The other thing that really matters is activity, because it's not just about where we live, it's about all the other things we do. Where do we go to work? Where do we go to school? Where do we shop? And thinking about that, realizing that we live in a world now where jobs aren't just 9 to 5, that if you're going to depend on transit, you need transit to be there for you on a Sunday morning when you go to the grocery store, but the person who works in that grocery store also needs it to be there for them when they get to work. And what successful transit does is it connects major centers of activity. And that's not just downtowns, it's all of the other centers we have. And again, that's something where you can see real challenges in the Bay Area. Next. If you look historically at the 1970s planning, for example, BART actually bypassed some of those centers. Here's Pill Hill in Oakland, a whole concentration of hospitals, exactly where you want transit to be, yet the transit station at MacArthur is off in the middle of the freeway off to the side. Next. And you're also seeing a lot of land use patterns that are employment at a level of density that's too low with very little walkability that get incredibly hard to serve. And when we talked about ridership on VTA earlier, that's part of the problem. So next, you can see successful transit systems are those that connect multiple centers. Caltrain, for example, is one of the highest performing commuter rail systems in the United States because it connects San Jose at one end, San Francisco at the other, and a series of walkable centers and major centers of activity like Stanford University in between. Next. But the trick is those really need to be on a straight line. You need to find reasonable ways to connect them. And what you see in the South Bay sometimes here, like this light rail line, is that where that density is too low, where the jobs are too spread out, it's hard to figure out any kind of transit that works well. So again, land use patterns really matter here. Land use decisions really matter here. Next. Another really major factor is walkability. This is why street design matters. This is why good sidewalks matter. This is why safe crosswalks matter. Every transit trip either starts or ends as a walking trip or a biking trip, and every high ridership transit system gets the bulk of its ridership from people who actually walk to transit. Next. Another major thing is connectivity, that every transit system, the lines in that system do not work by themselves. They work together as a system. Next. And that's been part of Bay Area thinking for a long time. So you look at these BART stations, which are also major bus transfer hubs. Here you can see two modes, two agencies working together to create a larger, more useful system. And you can look around the Bay Area and see some places where those connections work really well. You can see other places where they don't work nearly as well. Getting those hubs right really matters. But connections aren't just physical. Next. They're also about things like fares. And you can look at something like the Clipper card and say, this is good. We're creating better connectivity across a region because this one card works everywhere. Next. But if you peer underneath the Clipper card, you realize there's dozens of different agencies with different fare structures, and often those fare structures are an impediment to the transit network. The fact that the cost to go from point A to point B on a bus is different than the cost to go from point A to point B on a train. And one of the ways in which Bay Area transit could be a lot better is if those fares were harmonized better. If you go to Germany, you see ideas like the Verkehrsverbund, where if you're in Munich, if you want to go from point A to point B, it costs you the same regardless of which operator you use, regardless of which mode you use, and regardless of whether you need to make a transfer or not. In the Bay Area at this point, I think fares are still an impediment to connectivity rather than something that enables people to use the system seamlessly. Next. Also critically important, and anybody who rides transit knows this, is frequency. Frequency is the difference between whether you plan your life around transit or transit is there when you need it. So if you do every 15 minutes or better, you can just show up, you can just wait, you know transit will be along. If on the other hand, you're on an hourly bus route, you have a choice of being 5 minutes late or 55 minutes early. Next. If you look at the core of the Bay Area, frequent transit has really good coverage. San Francisco has some of the best coverages of frequent transit anywhere in the United States. Next. But as you go further afield, that really tails off. The Santa Clara Valley is doing okay, but the Southern East Bay, for example, is in really bad shape. Next. If you look at the Fremont, San Leandro area, if you look over in other parts of the East Bay, you see really gaps in this coverage. Next. And here's moving northwards, you can see Concord, Walnut Creek, for example. The BART stations have frequent service. There's one frequent shuttle route. But otherwise, you have large areas with fairly dense population, which do not have frequent transit service. Next. Travel time also matters, obviously. Next. But so does reliability. Whether I will get there in a reliable amount of time is as important as the time it takes. Reliability is what can cost me my job or what can get me fired. Next. And we need to think about capacity. How many people can that transit actually carry? This is something which in a lot of cases isn't the limit at all. There's a lot of spare capacity on a lot of transit systems, but the Bay Area actually has some examples where capacity really matters. Next. This is Geary, for example, where the level of ridership on those bus routes is really more than a bus route can reasonably handle. There are corridors in the Bay Area where an upgrade in the capacity of service and with it the reliability and speed of service is desperately needed. And again, I think often that investment hasn't come in those places. Next. And some of that has to do with regional politics. On the left, for example, is the Geary bus. On the right, you can see 3 different rail systems, eBART, BART to Livermore, and SMART. Those red lines look awfully impressive on a regional map, but all 3 of those lines added together carry fewer people than that little red line on the left. Sometimes systems which look really impressive on a regional basis really don't reflect that in ridership. Next. And I would say another really important factor is legibility. I love this picture. This is in Santa Monica. You can see your destination, which is the beach. You can see the transit station. You can see where the train's going. You can see how you're going to get there. Do we make transit systems that are easy to understand and easy to use? We should all be looking at networks as if we were a first-time rider and thinking about how would this network work for me. Next. And finally, I would point out inclusivity. Do we have networks where everybody feels welcome? And this covers a lot of things. It covers things like policing of transit networks. Do people feel afraid and intimidated by the methods we use to enforce fares? And I think that's very much the case on a lot of transit systems. It also covers other things like, for example, stroller policies. If you're a mother trying to use transit, that policy on what strollers can do on that bus or that train will have a big role in how useful that transit is to you. A good transit system feels welcoming to everybody. Next. And I would say that the fundamental point of all of this is simple, that we tend to spend a lot of time talking about trains and buses, but we ought to take a lot more time to talk about people. And that's fundamentally what the book is about. Next. And with that, I'm looking forward to our questions later. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, this is Christy Wagoner, Director of Planning at Samtrans, and I will be taking over the presentation. Thank you so much, Christoph. That was really great information. I am really excited to talk about some of the initiatives that are currently underway at Samtrans. It dovetails nicely with the work you're doing, Christoph. So today I'm going to go through the initiatives that are currently underway at Samtrans. And let's see here. Okay, so we've got four initiatives I want to highlight for you today. The first is a new express bus service that we launched a few months ago. I wanted to talk to you about our US 101 Mobility Action Plan. I want to talk to you about a microtransit pilot that we launched a few months ago. And then really get into the Reimagine Samtrans effort, which is a big comprehensive study to really look at how to realign our fixed route services to better meet the mobility needs, the changing mobility needs of our riders and our community. Okay, so in 2018, we completed a study to look at the feasibility of basically reintroducing express bus service on the US 101 corridor. There is a project underway to bring a managed lane facility to the US 101 corridor in San Mateo County. And with that managed lane facility, it gives the agency the opportunity to really improve the reliability of service along that corridor. And US 101 is a really, really important corridor in our service area. It not only is a connector within San Mateo County, but it connects Silicon Valley and San Francisco, so it's hugely important. And so we really looked for opportunities to find a new express route or a series of new express routes that we could launch on the corridor and try to attract new riders. The express bus study identified 6 routes that we felt had really strong ridership potential, and we launched our first one in August. This is a route between Foster City and San Francisco. And on day one, ridership was beyond our expectations. We had to switch out our buses to get articulated buses on the service because we had standees. So that was a really great experience. Clearly, there's a market there. And what we're finding when we did a survey of those riders is we did get some people fully out of their cars, but people are looking at this as a one-seat ride when before they were making a transfer or having to drive 7 miles to a BART station. Even Caltrain, who is our sister agency, we share a building with Caltrain. Where Caltrain stops in San Francisco requires another a last mile to get to the financial district. So our new service was, I think, very attractive to people. We're seeing people use, one mode in the morning and a different mode in the afternoon, which is great, just offering those choices to people. And then we're looking to launch our next route, which will connect Palo Alto and Western San Francisco. So this is our Palo Alto Express route. We're definitely challenged with some operator shortages right now, so we're trying to be very smart with our planning. But we do see some potential to launch another route and move the dial on ridership. Now I'll switch gears to talk about something that's a little less transity. This is a US 101 Mobility Action Plan. And this is a collaborative effort with many, many different partners. We've got Caltrans, we've got the City and County Associations of Government in San Mateo County, we have the MTC, we've got the San Mateo County Transportation Authority, SFCTA, Transform, Chris is representing, and then we have the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. And really, it's the project is designed to look at ways to address the US 101 corridor in a non-infrastructure way. So really, are there TDM strategies? Are there other transit strategies we can initiate in that corridor? The 101 is not moving people as fast as it could. 78% of all vehicles on US 101 are carrying just one person. So there's a lot of opportunity to get more people moving on that corridor. Worsening congestion on that corridor limits access to jobs. We see a delay. Commuters experience nearly twice as much delay today as they did in 1998. And I think really importantly is US 101 causes disproportionate public health burdens and mobility constraints for nearby communities. And making trips on US 101 is very unpredictable. So we are working together plan, and really with the goal of offering reliable travel times for travelers, looking for ways to prioritize high capacity mobility options such as carpools or buses, and really foster healthy and sustainable communities. And what's important as the team is working on strategies, and we've done a lot of public outreach and surveying, we have a big stakeholder group weighing in on this and a technical advisory group. We're trying to look at everything with an equity lens, right? It is really important that we not only think about this from what just moves the dial, but how are we reaching the most vulnerable populations and treating them equitably. So that project the phase 1 of this project will wrap up probably by the early part of next year, and then we will look to see what kind of strategies we can actually implement. Samtrans on demand. So a lot of transit agencies are really getting into this technology-enabled transit. So, and Samtrans is no different. Much like many other Bay Area transit agencies, we have launched a microtransit pilot to really understand, is this a service model that makes sense for us, particularly where we have that low density challenge. We have San Mateo County has a great, we have density along our Bayside area, along the El Camino Real and our US 101 corridor, but we also have coastside areas, Half Moon Bay and Pacifica, that are very, very challenging to serve with fixed route. As you just heard Christoph say, what's important in quality transit is density, and there really isn't much density there. So we launched this microtransit pilot to see what that customer experience felt like, to see operationally how does it feel like, to understand what productivity we can expect from this, and to really understand what feels right for a public transit agency that's trying to be more like an Uber or a Lyft. Like what are the wait times that we should be trying to achieve? So we're evaluating right now. We're going to our board in a few weeks with our preliminary evaluation, and I'll just say that I think microtransit has a home, but I think it matters where it is placed, and I think the market needs to be right. It's not a very productive service. It cannot compete with fixed route, but I think it does have a home, and we're really continuing to look outside the box, beyond the bus, looking at ways to encourage people to get out of their cars and try transit. And then lastly, we have a big study underway. It's a big comprehensive operational analysis called Reimagine Samtrans, and this is a big, just soup to nuts look at how we run our service. A lot of other metro areas have done this type of work. It's time for us to do it. It's been years since we've done this. We really need to answer the question, where have all the riders gone? We need to really understand where are the transit-friendly land uses in our county. We need to understand what trade-offs people are willing to make. And all of this needs to be filtered through a lens of, an operator shortage that we are seriously dealing with. I mean, it speaks to the cost of living in the Bay Area. And so this is just a very important project. We are just starting it. So here's my timeline. We are launching our outreach. Actually, I'm going to be in East Palo Alto Saturday, tabling, trying to talk to riders. So we're going out over the next few weeks to talk to riders, talk to the community, talk to our bus operators. We've spent the last few months doing a lot of market research. We had focus groups and we did a countywide survey. And then we've also been digging into our data to understand the state of our system. Where are we efficient? Where is there room for improvement? And really the end goal is to implement a new bus network in 2021 that addresses the changing mobility needs of our riders. And I would expect it to move the dial on ridership. So it's an exciting project. Our website just went live literally a few minutes ago, reimaginesamtrans.com. So for those of you who care or are in this area, please, check the website out and get involved and share with your networks. So I'll stop talking, and I think I'll hand the mic back over to Chris, who will facilitate some Q&A.
Okay, excellent. So we're merging into the Q&A portion here, as Christy mentioned, and I already see a few questions that have come through. We'll get to those, but I have selfishly a couple questions that I want to pose. So Christy, you mentioned or alluded to the issue of hiring transit operators and retaining transit operators. I know that we have some issues in some parts of the Bay where the buses just aren't coming when they're supposed to. And I understand that in Denver, they've had a real significant increase in service provided, new transit service, but now they're having the issue of filling those jobs. So how are you guys, is that a big issue for you? How are you addressing it? How does it impact your service? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. Thanks for that question. It is definitely not, we're not unique in this challenge. Yeah, Denver is definitely came out with some significant cuts. And yeah, we're facing similar challenges. Dynamically, every day, we've got our dispatchers doing their very best to cover runs so that we have seamless service and consistent, reliable service. We are looking at why attrition rates are going up. I mean, some of it is just the nature of the workforce retiring. I think also there, you know, what I'm curious to hear, in particular with Denver, they weren't seeing an issue with paying the operators enough. It was the working conditions, and once they were on board, it's like requiring overtime. I think that there is something to be said for the the work environment. And what we're doing internally is looking for looking at creative ways to reach, to try to advertise our hiring. We're looking at like retention bonuses, referral bonuses. But I also really think that the Reimagine process will help us uncover some of those working condition challenges that operators face, like where can I use the bathroom, or having to deal with customers. We've got buses that homeless people ride on all night because there's no place to stay and it's cold out. So, I don't intend to solve everything, but I think it's important transit agencies listen and have the conversation and just try to identify those solutions. So hope that's a good enough answer.
That's great. And Christoph, anything you'd like to add there? No? Okay.
Christoph is muted. If you unmute yourself.
Oh,
there you go.
I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah, I mean, I clearly it has been a nationwide problem. And I think people tend to not really appreciate what a hard job it is to drive a bus. And the more congested the streets get, the harder it gets. And it's both a customer service position and a driving position at the same time. And I like to point about network planning too, that a lot of times when we are making network planning decisions, we're very much impacting how that bus driver's day will be like. And one of the things we achieved in Houston is, for example, is coming up with more straight shifts, where before we had a lot more operators who worked for a couple of hours and had to take a couple hours off, and then we're back on for a couple of hours. And by having a system which was less peak focused, we were able to actually create better working conditions there. But the fundamental irony here is that the same Bay Area housing problems, which are actually driving the need for transit as people make longer commutes, are also making it harder and harder for agencies to find drivers, because where people can afford to live is often quite far away from where we need the bus operators to report to work. But this is one of those problems that transit agencies really can't solve by themselves.
And that actually leads to my second question, and actually was related to one of the questions that was posed by our listeners, which is what's the relationship between preserving low income populations near transit and, for example, transit ridership? Shouldn't we be serving all the perspective of all riders are created equal? We have a little bit of data on our end that shows that the closer that folks live near transit, of course, the more likely they are to use it. But when broken down by income, extremely low and very low income households use transit at a much higher rate, and also drive at a much lower rate and have less vehicle ownership than moderate and higher income households. And you can check that out on our website. It's called Why Creating and Preserving Affordable Homes Near Transit is a Highly Effective Climate Protection Strategy, which was a report that was produced with the California Housing Partnership Corporation. But wanted to get your take on that piece, the importance of affordable housing and things like anti-displacement measures when we're talking about transit and the intersection with transit ridership.
If I could start, so that's a really super important link to make, is that affordable housing and that quality transit, especially in the Bay Area where affordability is just diminishing. So I think transit agencies need to understand who their bus riders are. We know from our data that our bus riders on average make less than $50,000 a year. Okay, I don't know what the low income threshold is in San Mateo County. I feel like it must be over $100,000 a year. It's super high. So our riders are very low income, to your point, Chris. They are frequent riders. There has been a resegregation within the Bay Area population. We need to really understand where our most vulnerable populations are, where we see the lowest income populations, and look. I mean, that's really where your transit is going to be the most productive. And that's what we're learning. We need to go where the demographics indicate that there's a transit-rich environment, which is the density, and in our case, lower income populations, minority groups. I mean, those are all, and low and less access to vehicles, households that don't have access to vehicles. All of those things combined create what we're calling like a transit propensity index. And that's really looking at, just on a map, what areas make the most sense, are more likely to reduce transit riders. And I'll just say, just to toot our horn, we were very fortunate to partner with an affordable housing developer in East Palo Alto and the city of East Palo Alto. And we received combined, I think it was a $20 million grant from the state through the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities grant. And Samtrans received $2.25 million to support 3 fully electric buses that will run future express route service between East Palo Alto and San Bruno BART, which is amazing. And part of this program, the developer has to provide transit passes for 3 years for everyone that lives in that community. And that's amazing. And so we need to make it easy to ride the bus. We need to make it convenient. The fares and integrating fares and services are so key, and it's such a challenge in the Bay Area. But for Samtrans, we need to definitely pay attention to affordability and those low-income populations and really link them to transit.
Yeah, that example that you provide is great because you're linking the housing, the transit, and even the TDM and incentives to use transit. So that is a great example there. Christoph, anything to add on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Jarrett Walker expresses this really well. I think one of the fundamental problems we've had with US transit systems is actually how we think about this question. You hear a lot of discussion about transit-dependent riders and choice riders. And I think that discussion is problematic in 2 ways. The first is, as soon as you think about transit-dependent riders, you start taking them for granted. If you say somebody has no choice but to ride transit, you're not really creating much of an incentive to make their trip better. And I think one of the things we really need to focus on is there are a lot of transit riders right now whose transit experience is not very good, who are suffering through very slow, very unreliable, often very indirect service. And I think improving those trips is really important. The other thing is, when we start talking about choice riders, I think we tend to have the wrong picture in our head. We aren't thinking about somebody who has a car but can just barely afford it, whose household budget would be a lot better if they were able to use transit. Instead, we're thinking about, I don't know, some attorney in their BMW. And we start planning transit for a very specific high-income demographic. And you see that all over the Bay Area. I mean, that is why BART passes without stopping past some of the densest parts of Oakland, where there are a lot of people who would benefit from that service. But when that service was planned in the 70s, it was not planned for them. It was planned to get those suburban commuters to San Francisco as quickly as possible. And you see this show up in our transit systems over and over again. I think fares is a really good example. The fact that in the East Bay, a BART trip is more expensive than an AC transit trip, or on the peninsula that a Caltrain trip is more expensive than a Samtrans trip. We're essentially sort of building economic distinctions into our transit system. And what that often means is that the low-income riders get the worst quality service. And in the Bay Area, that's not usually expressed within agencies. It's usually expressed between different agencies. But that's a political decision we've made. And I think there's a lot of opportunities when we think about fares and when we think about how different systems connect together to really make a lot of those low-income riders' trips a lot better. And that becomes more and more important as you see that suburbanization of poverty, as you see the distribution of low-income populations spread further and further out. And that also means we have to adjust our basic transit systems. Like I was talking about in terms of frequency, there are places we may think of as car-oriented, which have become increasingly low income, where there are a lot of people who really need that service, and we really need to increase that transit service so that it's there for them.
Definitely, and talking now about you're getting into issues of political will, and I think that's a good a segue into the question of how do we implement great transit. Some of the transit improvements that we're speaking of here can be very difficult. I had cited bus rapid transit implementation, so about 50% of my gray hairs are due to that. So what can advocates do? What can practitioners do? What are some good examples out there that you've seen where folks have been able to win great transit priority measures and so on and so forth, despite the kind of political roadblocks that we know exist?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the Bay Area is in a good position politically, in that, unlike in a lot of parts of the country, that generally elected officials will say they are for transit, and generally the transit funding exists. But as you point to, the hardest thing is often the more detailed decisions on the ground, and that you see places where, you know, politically they claim to be environmentally responsible and want to make more livable cities, but as soon as you come along and say, I want to take your parking away to build a bus lane, then suddenly they turn out to be really attached to their cars. So that making good transit is very much an on-the-ground issue, not a high-level political issue. And that means there's a lot of fights to be fought, and we can't depend on transit agencies to do the work for us, because there's an inherent limitation to what a transit agency staff member can say and can do. And ultimately, transit agencies can't do transformative things unless people in the community and elected officials give them the political space to do those things, which just underlines the importance of advocacy. It is absolutely essential that people who care about good transit be out there and be vocal about it. It is absolutely essential that they talk to their elected officials about it. It's absolutely essential that they be heard. And a lot of that is about telling a good story. That I think transit advocates really need to figure out, what story are they telling about transit? And that goes back to the people point, that I think sometimes advocates get too caught up in technology. And we talk about things like dedicated lanes rather than talking about things like faster and more reliable trips for the passengers. Really having this conversation be about making people's lives better, I think can lead to better transit.
Just to tack on to that, yeah, tell a story. There, you know, for this reimagine effort, what we need to do is we need to educate our board members and our policymakers, and they need to understand those on the ground service decisions and how those roll up into, you know, bigger policy level, you know, discussions. So I love what VTA is doing. They are trying to and doing a good job articulating the cost of congestion to their partner cities. I think that's super important, is developing good relationships with the cities that who we serve, and helping to educate them on what, like, for example, a transit signal priority or a queue jump or a bus only lane, what can that really do for the network? Putting dollar signs to things helps. But for me, I am a fan of over educating, and I'm bringing my board on a very long 18-month journey to reimagine the effort. And it's not only for us to listen to people, but it's for us to educate our riders about the trade-offs we have to make, but also educate the board too.
Definitely, and we have a couple minutes, and maybe the last question I'll pose is related to the little bit longer term, well, both shorter term and longer term trajectory in terms of this conversation that we're having about the future of transit, and that's the role of technology and innovation. And you know, a lot of folks look at the Ubers and Lyfts as a major threat to transit. What's your take on that? How do we make transit relevant you know, over the next 20, 30 years, considering the massive you know, shifts that have already occurred and that will likely occur in the future here? How do we leverage these technologies, and how do we ensure that they don't actually how do we ensure that they add value rather than cannibalize upon our transit systems?
Well, I'll start by saying I think that if Uber and Lyft are the future of transit, we're doomed. Because ultimately, everything that is great about transit is not true when you have one person driving one other person around. Uber and Lyft will never be as affordable as transit. They will never do the job of avoiding relieving congestion that transit does. In fact, they create more congestion than single occupant vehicles do, because you've now added the whole phenomenon of vehicles moving around. And the environmental footprint of moving one person in an entire vehicle will never be good for the planet. And it doesn't matter if that vehicle is electric. Just the simple land impact of that vehicle is still a huge problem. And so ultimately, number one answer to that is we need to make sure that cities and states have good policies in place to make sure that Uber and Lyft don't further increase congestion, don't take over the streets, don't slow down the buses. Regulation is a really big part of this. And likewise, that's accessibility, that's equity in Uber, you know, all of that stuff matters. But secondly, what I will say and really underline is it is absolutely true that ride hail is taking passengers away from transit. But when you look at where and when that's happening, it's happening when transit offers the worst service. In DC, they found the biggest losses were the times of the day when you had off-peak service with infrequent trains, and riders were fleeing because the service simply wasn't good enough. So I think the biggest piece of this is part of the opening that ride hail has found is that in much of the United States, we're not doing a good job of delivering good transit service. That the core thing transit agencies ought to be concerned about, which is carrying lots of people with frequent, reliable service in straight lines through dense areas, a lot of transit agencies really aren't focusing on and really are not doing a good job on. And I worry a little bit that some of the reaction to this that you see transit agencies do is say, we need to be more like Uber and Lyft. And I absolutely think there's a role in low density areas for the kind of app-based ride hailing, but that will always be low ridership service. And I think we really need to double down on what transit is really good at. And that to me is the answer.
Beautifully put. Christy, any thoughts on your end?
I couldn't even think of what to say other than what he said, and I need bus-only lanes. I need bus-only lanes, the end.
And we need technology to enforce those bus-only lanes.
Yes, we do, for sure.
Well, this has been awesome. I'm sure we could keep talking for hours. So thank you for both of you for sharing your wisdom, insight, and again to our partners here at Island Press for joining Transform and bringing this together, along with all of our partners as part of the community Connecting Community series. I suppose if folks have any questions, any follow-up questions for either of you, what's the best way to reach out? Do we have contact information?
Well, I'll say I'm at Christoph Spieler on Twitter, which is definitely a very good place to reach me, or I'm cspieler at hewitt-zollers.com.
And I am not on the Twitter, so you can probably just reach me through our Reimagine. It's reimagine@samtrans.com.
And for me, for any follow-up, this is Chris Lepe. Feel free to reach out via email, clepe@transformca.org. So thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And hope to hear from y'all if there's any questions or follow-up and interest in moving forward great transit for our region and beyond.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone.